Breaking right now, the British royal family mired in one of its biggest crises in history.
But inside those 5 words lives an entire story. A story of a plea that reached the right hands and was turned away. A story of a brotherhood that did not end in a fight, but in something far worse. A controlled, deliberate, permanent refusal. The kind that does not leave room for misunderstanding. Let me take you inside that room. The palace does not shake when a door closes. It absorbs it, swallows it whole. And on the morning that Prince William made his decision, the silence inside those walls was so complete, so deliberate, that even the people paid to fill rooms with careful words found themselves with nothing left to say. I need you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a story about 2 brothers who drifted apart. It is not a story about distance, or time, or the kind of ordinary family fractures that quietly heal themselves over the years when no one is watching. This is a story about a door. A very specific door. One that Harry spent years believing was merely closed. And one that William, with cold precision and a stillness that cut deeper than any argument ever could, has now locked from the inside. What happened inside Buckingham Palace in the weeks leading up to this moment is something the royal household desperately hoped would stay buried beneath layers of careful language and official silence. The palace prepared its statements.
I love my father, I love my brother, I love my family. I always do. Nothing of what I've done in this book or otherwise has ever been to, any intention to harm them or hurt them.
The aides chose their words with surgical care. And the world was handed a single sentence that carried the weight of everything the family refused to say out loud. No active reconciliation process. 5 words. That is all. Prince Harry had made a private request. Not a public statement. Not a press release designed to pressure the family through headlines. A private plea passed through the appropriate channels, asking for one meeting. A closed room. A conversation. Harry and the family, without cameras, without the world watching, sitting together long enough to see whether anything could still be repaired. In plain terms, a reconciliation meeting inside the royal family means one thing. It means you believe the wound is still survivable. It means you are saying, quietly, that the relationship has not yet crossed the line between damaged and destroyed. Harry sending that request was an act of hope. Maybe the last one he had left. But here is what the palace understood that Harry did not. Hope, inside an institution as old and as scarred as the British monarchy, is not always a virtue. Sometimes hope is a liability.
Horrible reaction from my family members, and then by all accounts, certainly from what I saw and what other people probably experienced, was they were on the back foot.
Sometimes hope is the thing that opens a door just wide enough for everything dangerous to walk back through. Hi viewers, I want to ask you something personal before we go any further. When someone has hurt your family deeply, do you believe in giving them one last chance, or do you think some doors should stay closed forever? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I read every single one. Because that question, that exact question, is the one William was sitting with when Harry's plea arrived. The request had been summarized, condensed into the kind of careful palace document designed to present sensitive information to senior family members without emotional contamination. A summary stripped of Harry's actual words. His tone. The specific weight he might have placed on certain sentences. What Charles received was the architecture of the plea without its heartbeat. Charles read it, set it down, and said nothing for a long moment. The king did not rush to his phone. He did not call William immediately.
Firstly, I'm devastated.
He sat with the page the way a man sits with news he has been expecting for a long time but still finds himself unprepared to receive. There is a particular kind of sadness that arrives not as a wave but as a slow pressure behind the eyes. Charles knew that pressure well by now. He had been carrying it for years. William was briefed separately. And this is where the story changes. Because when the summary reached William, something else came with it. An additional detail. a component of Harry's plea that no one in the room had fully prepared for. The briefing aide paused before delivering it. The kind of pause that tells you the next sentence matters more than everything that came before it. Harry's plea contained a personal sentence. Private. Specific. Addressed not to the family as a whole. Not to Charles. Not to the institution. To William alone. One sentence meant for his brother's eyes and no one else's. William did not ask to hear it.
We're here to celebrate the life of Granny and to mourn her loss. Can we come together as a family? But
he did not lean forward. He did not extend his hand for the page. He did not allow the aide to read it aloud. He simply looked at the briefing officer with an expression that had no anger in it, no impatience, no visible emotion at all, and said nothing. And his silence was its own instruction. The sentence remained unread. Think about what that means for a moment. Harry had reached across years of silence, across every interview and every accusation and every public wound, and placed one private sentence inside a formal palace plea. Something personal enough that it could not be included in the official summary. Something meant to reach William the brother, not William the future king. And William refused to receive it. Not because he did not know it was there. He knew. Not because he lacked the time. He had the time. He refused because reading it would have meant something. Receiving a private message from Harry would have created an obligation. A small opening. A hairline crack in the wall he had spent years reinforcing. And William had made a decision, long before that briefing room, long before Harry's plea arrived in its carefully prepared envelope, that no more cracks would be permitted. The door was not going to open. Not for a sentence. Not for a meeting. Not for one carefully staged photograph of brothers standing close enough to suggest that peace had returned to the House of Windsor. And as the palace aide marked the summary with the 4 words that would become the official position of the royal household, as the ink dried on the phrase that would eventually reach every television screen and every morning newspaper in Britain, Harry was still waiting. Still believing, somewhere in the space between hope and dread, that the answer had not yet been given. He was wrong. The answer had already been made. Not in a meeting. Not after careful deliberation between senior family members and their legal teams. The answer had been made the moment William chose not to hear the sentence that carried his name. And what led William to that moment, what built the wall that made this refusal not just possible but inevitable, goes back much further than Harry's plea. It goes back to a night at Windsor that the family has never publicly acknowledged. A night when grief was supposed to bring people closer, and instead produced the one wound that William swore he would never allow to be reopened. That night is where this story truly begins. There are nights that change everything. Not because something dramatic happens. Not because someone raises their voice or throws open a door or makes a declaration that echoes down a corridor. Some nights change everything because of what is said quietly, in a room full of grief, when people believe the emotion of the moment has lowered everyone's guard just enough. The Windsor Memorial Gathering was one of those nights. It had begun the way these private royal events always begin. With dignity. With the careful choreography of people who have spent their entire lives performing composure in rooms where composure is the only acceptable offering. The family had gathered after a remembrance event, the kind of occasion where the weight of history sits in every chair and no one needs to explain why the silences run long. Grief was present. So was duty. And for a short while, the two sat together without conflict. Harry had arrived carrying something beyond grief. He carried the particular energy of a man who had decided that this was the moment. That the shared sorrow in the room had created a window that would not stay open long, and that if he did not say what he had come to say, the window would close and another year would pass in the same painful silence. He believed he was reading the room correctly. He was wrong. The request came out carefully at first. Harry wanted the family to move toward something public. A sign. A signal to the world that the fracture was healing. And at the center of that signal, he wanted Catherine. He wanted the Princess of Wales to attach her name, her presence, her carefully protected public image to a peace statement. A shared message that would tell the world the wound between the brothers was closing. Stop right there. Because you need to understand what that request actually meant for Catherine before you can understand why it lit something cold and permanent inside William. Catherine had spent years doing something extraordinarily difficult. She had maintained her dignity inside a story that kept trying to pull her into its center. Every public appearance, every carefully chosen word, every decision to stay composed while the world speculated about what she privately thought had been an act of deliberate self-protection.
The decision has been a surprise as well as not a surprise. For the time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK.
Not coldness. Protection. The distinction matters enormously. She was not uninvested. She was disciplined. And that discipline had cost her in ways the public never fully saw. Harry's request would have dismantled all of it. If Catherine attached her name to a peace statement, the world would not read it as a family decision. The world would read it as Catherine's forgiveness. Her endorsement. Her personal declaration that the things said, the interviews given, the accusations made, had been weighed and released. She would become the face of reconciliation for a wound she had never created and had no power to undo alone. And if she refused, the world would call her cold. Calculating. The obstacle standing between two brothers and their reunion. Either path led somewhere damaging. Harry's request had not offered Catherine a choice. It had offered her a trap with two doors, both of them leading somewhere she did not deserve to go. William saw it instantly. The moment Harry finished speaking, before anyone else in the room had fully processed what had been asked, William's expression changed. Not dramatically. There was no sharp intake of breath, no sudden movement. Just a stillness that dropped over his features like a shade being drawn across a window. He saw the trap. He saw Catherine standing inside it without having been warned it was there. And something inside him went quiet in the way that things go quiet right before they become permanent. Harry's voice tightened when William said nothing immediately. The silence felt like resistance, and resistance felt like betrayal, and so Harry said the thing that broke the room in half. He told William he was choosing the crown over his own blood. The accusation landed exactly the way Harry intended it to land. Like a verdict. Like something that had been building for years and had finally found its sentence. And William did not deny it loudly. He did not reach across the space between them and argue the point with heat. He looked at his brother for a long moment with an expression that carried something more devastating than anger. He looked at him with recognition. Because William understood that there was partial truth inside the accusation. He was choosing duty. He was choosing the institution. He was choosing the protected future of a family that could not survive another cycle of public exposure dressed up as private healing. And he was not ashamed of that choice. But he was not going to stand in a room full of grief and pretend that Harry's request had been made without calculation, without the awareness that Catherine's name attached to a statement would generate the kind of headlines that served Harry's narrative far more than it served the family's peace. William left the gathering early. He gave one instruction to a senior aide before he walked out. The instruction was brief, specific, and absolute. No future agreement involving the family would use Catherine as a bargaining element. She would not be positioned as a symbol of unity. She would not be placed at the center of any reconciliation arrangement. Not now. Not later. Not under any circumstances. That instruction became the invisible architecture beneath every decision that followed. Catherine learned what had happened that night not from William directly, but from a documented account prepared by a senior aide who had been present and briefed afterward. She read her own name inside a conflict she had not attended. She saw herself described as a proposed peace symbol for a wound she had not inflicted. And she felt, with quiet and absolute clarity, the particular exhaustion of being pulled into a story that kept rewriting itself around her without her permission. She said very little when she finished reading. But what she said to William later, in private, away from aides and documents and the machinery of royal decision-making, carried more weight than anything recorded in any official account. She told him she understood why he had walked out. And she told him she understood why the line he had drawn that night could never be moved. William carried that conversation into every room he entered afterward. And now, weeks later, with Harry's new plea sitting inside the palace and the personal sentence still unread, William was walking into the most important room of all. The private meeting room where the two brothers would face each other without intermediaries, without staff positioned to soften the collision, without anything between them except the years. The door closed behind them both. And what happened inside that room is something the palace has never officially confirmed, and something neither brother has publicly described. But the people who were positioned just outside it, the aides who felt the quality of silence change in the corridor, the staff who watched William's face when he emerged, all of them understood the same thing. Whatever had been left between the brothers walked into that room. None of it walked back out. William had entered with a particular kind of stillness. Not the stillness of someone who is calm. The stillness of someone who finished grieving a decision before the decision had been delivered. He had already moved through the loss. What remained was the execution of a conclusion he had reached long before Harry's plea arrived, long before the Windsor Memorial, long before the interviews and the accusations and the years of careful public distance. The conclusion had been forming slowly, the way ice forms, barely visible until suddenly it holds the weight of everything above it. Harry stood near the table. Restless. The kind of restless that comes from hope colliding with dread in equal measure. He had prepared for resistance. He had not prepared for the particular quality of William's composure, which communicated something far more final than anger ever could. Anger leaves room for reversal. Composure like this does not. Harry began with the request as he had always intended to frame it. One meeting. One room. One chance to speak to Charles without layers of staff language between them. He wanted to look his father in the eye and say the things that could not be filtered through palace summaries and official accounts. He wanted one signal, however small, that the family had not yet decided to treat the fracture as permanent. He said it clearly. He said it without the defensiveness that had defined so many of their earlier conversations. And for a moment, the room held something fragile and almost possible. Then William spoke. His voice was level. Not gentle, but not cruel. The kind of voice that belongs to someone who has rehearsed nothing because nothing needs rehearsing when the answer has already been decided. He told Harry that one meeting would not remain one meeting. That the moment a private gathering was arranged, it would become a piece of information that moved outward, through staff, through family, through the invisible channels that connected the palace to the world waiting outside it. And when it reached that world, it would become a story. And the story would be written before the meeting had even concluded. One photograph, he said. One photograph of the two of them standing in proximity, or of Harry shaking Charles's hand, or of Catherine present in any capacity, would tell the world that forgiveness had been granted. That the family had accepted the terms of an unspoken negotiation. That the years of pain and public damage had been absorbed and released. And none of that would be true. Because truth and appearance had not been the same thing inside this family for a very long time. Harry pushed back. Of course he did. He told William that hiding behind duty was easier than extending mercy. That the crown had become a reason to avoid everything human. That William had confused protecting the institution with protecting himself from the discomfort of repair. The words came out with the force of something that had been held in a long time, and they landed in the room with a particular kind of weight that Harry clearly intended as a final argument. William did not flinch. He let the words arrive. Let them settle. And then he said, quietly, that trust could not be rebuilt through pressure, or timing, or the emotional urgency of a man who had run out of other options. He said it without contempt. That was the most devastating part. There was no contempt in his voice at all. Just a finality so complete it had moved past emotion entirely. And then Harry mentioned Catherine. He had not planned to. Or perhaps he had. It is impossible to know now what Harry intended in that moment versus what simply escaped from the part of him that was still raw and still searching for any lever that might shift the conversation. But her name entered the room, attached to a suggestion that her presence at a meeting would communicate something meaningful to the family and to the public about the possibility of genuine repair. William stopped him. Not loudly. Not with the kind of interruption that escalates a conversation into something irreversible. He stopped him with a single, flat, immediate sentence that communicated something so clearly that no one in proximity could have misread it. Catherine would not be placed at the center of this. Not as a symbol. Not as a gesture. Not as proof of anything. She was not a bridge. She was not a peace offering. She was his wife. And whatever this family had been through, whatever Harry believed needed to be demonstrated publicly, Catherine's name, her face, her presence, would not be used to paper over a wound that ran far deeper than any photograph could reach. William placed his hand flat on the table. That gesture ended the room. Not dramatically. There was no raised voice that followed it, no chair pushed back, no moment of cinematic confrontation that could be edited into a single defining image. Just a hand, pressed flat against a surface, with a steadiness that communicated everything his words had already said and then sealed it. Harry stood across from him with the anger still present in his body but the argument already gone from his eyes. Because he understood, in the particular way that you understand things you have been dreading, that he was not losing this conversation. He had lost it before he walked through the door. He had lost it the night of the Windsor Memorial. He had lost it every time the family absorbed another public wound and quietly rearranged itself around the absence. William left the room. An aide outside received a brief instruction. The palace summary was updated. The language was finalized. And somewhere in a building full of gilded corridors and carefully controlled silences, the decision became official before Harry had even reached his car. 4 words. No active reconciliation. The confirmation reached Harry by phone. Not in person. Not through a family member who might have softened the delivery with something human. A call. Careful language. Each word chosen to leave no room for interpretation, no gap through which hope might find a way to breathe. Harry listened without interrupting. The room around him seemed to change temperature as the message was delivered. Not the dramatic cold of shock but the slower, deeper cold of something you already knew arriving in the form you had feared most. Official. Sealed. Beyond appeal. His jaw tightened. His hand stayed completely still. And then the anger that rose in him drained away before it could become anything useful, leaving behind something quieter and far more permanent. The understanding that this was not a delay. Not a pause. Not a moment of palace caution that might soften with time and careful management. This was the answer. Meghan watched him from across the room. She had learned, over years of watching Harry navigate the complicated grief of his family, to read the difference between his anger and his devastation. Anger moved in him visibly, animated his features, brought him forward. This was not anger. This was the stillness that followed the moment a man realizes the thing he has been fighting toward does not exist anymore. She said nothing at first. Because there are moments when the most loving thing you can offer someone is the space to absorb the weight of what has just arrived without being asked to manage your response for anyone else's comfort. Harry asked one question. He asked whether Charles had personally seen the wording before it was confirmed. Whether the king, his father, had read the 4 words and allowed them to stand as the family's official position. The answer came carefully, as all answers did now. Yes. Charles had seen it. Charles had not overruled it. But the decisive weight, the source of the refusal, the hand that had closed the door with enough force to make it permanent, that had been William. Harry stood up. Not in rage. Not with the kind of sudden physical movement that signals escalation. He stood because sitting still had become impossible. Because the body sometimes needs to rearrange itself around the shape of something that does not fit anywhere comfortable. Meghan understood immediately what the confirmation meant beyond the personal wound. Without a symbolic return, without one shared moment that the world could read as proof that the family had not yet fully closed ranks, every appearance Harry made would now be measured against this confirmation. Every absence would be defined by it. The palace had not simply refused a meeting. It had issued a statement that would follow him into every room he entered for the rest of his public life. That evening, William sat with Catherine in the private quiet that existed beyond the reach of aides and official accounts. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at him when the day had cost him something he would not volunteer. She had a particular way of asking without asking, of making space for whatever needed to be said without engineering the moment. She asked him whether it had broken something inside him. Not the decision. She understood the decision. She had understood it before it was made, had felt the logic of it settle into the right shape when William explained the Windsor confrontation and the trap Harry had tried to build around her name. She was not asking whether he had made the right choice. She was asking what the right choice had taken from him. William was quiet for a long time. And then he told her the part he had not included in any briefing, any official account, any version of events that had moved beyond this room. He told her that Harry's plea had specifically included a request for her presence. Not as a witness. Not as a bystander. As an active participant in the meeting. Her attendance would have been the signal, the image, the proof the world needed to believe reconciliation was genuine. Catherine absorbed this without visible reaction. But something moved behind her eyes. The particular expression of someone who has just understood the full shape of something they had only partially seen before. She thought about what that presence would have meant. How a single image of her standing beside Harry in any configuration of apparent peace would have been pulled apart, analyzed, weaponized by every corner of the public conversation that had spent years deciding what she represented in this story. She would have had no control over the meaning assigned to her presence. The image would have existed independently of her intention. It would have become the property of a narrative she had never agreed to enter. William watched her face and saw the moment she understood it completely. He told her that was why the answer had been no. Not just for the institution. Not just for Charles, who was tired in ways the public would never fully see. For her. Because whatever healing might eventually come to this family, it would not be built on the foundation of Catherine being positioned as its proof of concept. She reached across and took his hand. She did not tell him he had made the right choice. She did not offer reassurance or comfort framed as agreement. She simply held his hand in the quiet of a room that had absorbed more weight than any official account would ever capture. And William, who had entered every other room that day with the controlled stillness of a man performing certainty, allowed himself in this one private moment to look exactly as tired as he was. He had protected everyone he needed to protect. He had not won anything. Britain woke the next morning to a headline that required no explanation. No way back. 2 words beneath a split image of the brothers. Not a photograph of a confrontation, not a moment of visible conflict, just 2 men photographed separately, in different contexts, placed beside each other on a front page in a way that communicated every distance the palace had spent years carefully not naming. The headline spread before breakfast. Before the morning news programs had finished their first cycles. Before the people gathered near the gates of Buckingham Palace had finished reading it on their phones and begun speaking to each other in the lower, more careful voices people use when something feels like the end of something. A broadcaster used the phrase that would be repeated for the rest of the day. The end of the last credible reconciliation attempt. Not a pause. Not a chapter. An ending. The public split along the lines it had always occupied when this family was the subject. Harry supporters looked at the confirmation and saw a son pushed to the outer edge of his own bloodline, refused even the basic human offer of a private conversation with his father. William supporters looked at the same confirmation and saw a future king finally refusing to allow the institution to be held hostage by an unresolvable private wound. Both readings contained truth. Neither contained the full story. William saw the headline from inside the palace and did not celebrate it. He did not call anyone to discuss the coverage or track the reaction building through television and social media and the morning conversations happening in living rooms across the country. He sat with it the way he had sat with the decision itself. Quietly. with the particular awareness of someone who understands that a choice made in private does not stay private, and that the version the world receives will always be simpler and sharper and less merciful than the truth. He looked like a man who had done what needed to be done and was now living inside the cost of it. Harry, somewhere beyond the reach of the palace's official silence, was living inside a different cost. Not the cost of a decision made, but the cost of a decision received. The cost of having extended a final reach toward something and felt the distance increase rather than close. He had understood the codes of this institution from the inside. He had spent his entire early life learning the weight of its silences, the meaning of its pauses, the specific language it used when it was closing a door and needed you to understand that the closing was permanent. He understood this one. The door was not stuck. It had never been stuck. It had been locked by a man who loved him once with the uncomplicated ease of brothers who shared the same grief and the same strange life, and who now carried a different kind of love, the kind that has hardened into something institutional, something that answers to more than blood. Charles felt it as a father before he accepted it as a king. He sat with the knowledge that one son had asked to come closer and the other had decided, with a certainty that left no room for revision, that closer was no longer something the family could safely offer. He understood why William had reached that conclusion. He did not dispute the reasoning. But understanding a decision and being unaffected by it are not the same thing, and Charles was not unaffected. He simply chose not to intervene. Because the future king would need to manage the future damage. And Charles, who had spent years watching every attempt at repair generate new pressure and every private concession become public currency, understood that the monarchy could not keep bending itself around one wound indefinitely without the bending eventually becoming the break. So he let the sentence stand. No active reconciliation. Catherine remained the quiet center of a story she had never asked to anchor. She had felt the cost of being pulled into narratives she had not created. She had paid the price of being the contrast, the symbol, the proof of various competing stories about this family that the public had been writing for years. She understood, with a clarity that came from having lived inside the consequences, that her presence in any reconciliation arrangement would have been immediately converted into meaning that served everyone except her. William had protected her from that. And the palace had spoken. Not loudly. Not with the kind of dramatic declaration that invites immediate response and ongoing debate. The palace had spoken in the way it always speaks when it means to be final. Quietly. Precisely. With the absolute confidence of an institution that has survived centuries of internal fracture by learning exactly how much silence is required to make a statement permanent. There is no next conversation waiting in the wings of this story. No private channel still open, no back door through which a carefully worded message might eventually find its way to a warmer reception. What existed between these brothers, the private understanding, the shared history, the particular shorthand of two people who grew up inside the same impossible life, that still exists somewhere beneath the surface of all of this. But the bridge to it has been removed. Not in anger. That is the thing that is hardest to absorb about this story. Not in a moment of heat or impulse or the kind of decision that gets made when emotion is running faster than judgment. William's refusal was the product of years. Of accumulation. Of watching every open door become a new source of damage. Of standing in a room at Windsor while grief was supposed to hold everyone together and watching his brother try to use that grief as leverage against the one person William would protect above everything else. The plea arrived. The sentence went unread. The meeting was refused. The confirmation was delivered. And the headline printed the truth in 2 words that required no explanation from anyone. Harry was left outside the decision. William was left inside its weight. And the story of how this family arrived here, the full story, with every private conversation and every official document and every moment of quiet devastation that the palace worked so hard to keep from becoming public record, is far longer and far darker than what you have heard today. Because what I have not yet told you is what was in that personal sentence Harry wrote for William. The one that went unread. The one that William refused to hear without explanation or apology. There are 2 people inside the palace who know what it said. And one of them, in a private conversation that was never meant to be documented, allowed it to be described. What it contained changes everything you think you understand about why William made the choice he made. And that is exactly where we are going next.